I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, how to inoculate kids against substance abuse and addiction. Hi, my name is Jess, and I'm an alcoholic. It has taken me such a long time to arrive at this sentence, to be able to put the word alcoholic in such close proximity to the word I, and to face the reality that no matter how diligent I am, I can't control my drinking and must live a completely sober life. 8 years on in my recovery, I am grateful to be here, beyond the shame, guilt, secrets, and lies. Now that my own relationship with addictive substances is well in hand, it's time for me to figure out how to prevent my children from having to travel the same path. These are the opening lines of my guest's book, The Addiction Inoculation: Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. I am speaking with Jessica Lahey. She writes about education, parenting, and child welfare for the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Atlantic, and is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed. She is a member of the Amazon Studios Thought Leader Board and wrote the curriculum for Amazon Kids' The Stinky and Dirty Show. She lives in Vermont with her husband and 2 sons. Substance abuse is a complex topic. Jessica has written a supportive and useful guide for parents and educators who want to understand the roots of substance abuse, identify who is most at risk, and implement practical steps for prevention. Having worked as a teacher in substance abuse programs for teens and seen firsthand the perils of addiction, Jessica was determined to inoculate her 2 adolescent sons against their most dangerous inheritance. She's an astute writer, and The Addiction Inoculation is a comprehensive resource for parents and educators. She addresses things like who gets addicted and why, genetics and personality traits, epigenetics, the role of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, which I was very happy to see addressed in this book, why it's important to delay use, how to talk about it with kids, and how we can improve prevention, and so much more. Please enjoy this honest conversation with Jessica Lahey. Before we get to today's show, a quick shout out to our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most nutrient-dense whole foods daily supplement that I've ever tried. As you know, I'm a huge advocate for cultivating and practicing what I call radical self-care. If you want to show up greatly in your parenting, you need to take care of yourself. And part of radical self-care is eating right. But with so many stressors in our lives, in our go, do culture, juggling busy schedules and multitude of responsibilities, maintaining a healthy, well-balanced diet can be difficult, especially for parents. And that can leave us deficient in key nutrients that our bodies need to thrive. This is where Athletic Greens can help. It's a life-changing nutritional habit. Their daily all-in-one superfood powder is your nutritional essential. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you one thing with all the best things. I've been using it for the past 2 years as part of my morning routine, and I love the simplicity, the ease of it, and it's delicious too. 1 tasty scoop of AG1 Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, whole food sourced ingredients, probiotic, and more that all work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid with digestion, and support a healthy immune system, all without the need to take multiple products or pills. I take it in the morning and I'm ready to face the day. And right now, for the listeners of my podcast, Athletic Greens has a special offer. A free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Simply visit athleticgreens.com/authentic parenting and you'll be able to access this offer. Again, simply visit athleticgreens.com/authentic parenting and get your free supply of vitamin D for a year and 5 free travel packs. How are you this morning?
Very well, thank you.
Good to see you in person.
Good to see you too. How are you doing this morning? Where are you coming from again?
Princeton, New Jersey.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It turns out Princeton University has the most drinking.
Well, as you read in Addiction Inoculation, there was some wonderful research that comes out of it, though. So that's okay. There we go.
Oh, yes, I learned a lot. How is the weather in Vermont?
It's beautiful, dark, but beautiful. We're way past the peak leaves. Obviously, the leaves are gone and everything, but I'm in this little bowl that stays a little warmer. So my trees are actually still kind of pretty. So and my parents are coming to visit. So it's all good. As soon as we're done, I have to start cleaning my house.
Oh, sounds good. Sounds good. I listened to you so much on your podcast. And I feel like I followed this book, from its idea to its entire process. And it's interesting to hold in your hand to see this finished product that somebody created. It's such a good experience.
It's pretty cool with my co-hosts with KJ Delantonia's books and Serena Bowen's books. It's really cool to be, in my process, and I love the process of writing and all that stuff. But what's amazing for me is when I'm reading like one of Serena's books and I see, oh yeah, we texted about that a year ago. She said, I really need to talk to, a divorce lawyer about this point of whatever. And then all of a sudden there it is in a book that I get to read and love. It's pretty cool. It's like having being a voyeur on, some of my favorite authors, which is just an amazing, amazing thing.
Which is a new thing, right? Before podcasting, before all the social media, we didn't have access to writers. We didn't know what their lives were like, what they were thinking, what they were eating, wearing, or dressing up for Halloween. Or in your case, I see your pets all the time, the dogs. Yeah. They're so adorable.
Actually, one of them is behind me right now. Luther sitting in the chair right behind me.
I see that. That's adorable. But I think we live in an interesting era that we can see what's happening in our favorite authors' lives. Same goes for podcasters. People always contact me and they say, I don't know you, but I also feel like I know you.
Yeah, the audiobook thing also does that. So I'm a huge audiobook fan, and I have my favorite narrators. And when I was recording The Gift of Failure, my first book, I got to sit down with the producer at the studio where I was recording, and he was like, oh man, I hardly ever get to talk to people who know all their favorite narrators' names. So I was really all in with the audiobook thing. And I definitely feel like when I listen to an audiobook narrator, or when I listen, especially with nonfiction, where a lot of nonfiction authors get to read their books, I start to feel like I know them. And so it's a weird phenomenon for then people to turn around and come, to events of mine and say, I feel like I know you because you're in my car with me, you're in my head. And that's, from my perspective, that is such a privileged place. That's, I have this vehicle to be in people's ears and in their heads and have them accustomed to my voice. And that's That's something really new for me. And I remember hearing a long time ago, I can't remember if it was David Sedaris or someone else. The author was saying, it's so weird for me when I'm out talking to people and they know stuff about my kids or about my life. And I'm like, how do you know that? And then I realized, oh, it's because I told you all that. It's a very strange place, but it's incredibly cool.
Yeah, that is. So this is an interesting book. It's a bit of a memoir too.
Mm-hmm.
And you open this book right there about your story. And it's pretty shocking. I want to start with that, with your story, because I see this phenomenon a lot in my neighborhood, in my friends. Everybody is just drinking. And those t-shirts that are mom juice and things like that, that promote this culture. But I would love for you to tell me that night of your mom's birthday. What happened that night?
So that's a really good question. I don't know what happened later. I have no memory of that. It was my mom's birthday, June 7th, 2013. And I went down to their house for a big party. And I drank too much and I blacked out. And my husband took me up to bed. And the next morning, my dad came into the room, and in what I consider to be the most loving act he has ever given me. And partially that's because, not just because it was my dad and he loves me and all that, but because, the topic of substance use and substance abuse is really scary for him. And for various reasons that, I don't go into just to protect their privacy, and he doesn't like conflict. So the fact that he loves me so much, and like conflict with me is just a horror show for him. So for him to deal with the fact that he doesn't like conflict, he has to tell me something that I might get angry about, something that I might get really defensive and upset about, and that he knows is going to upset me no matter how this goes. For him to come upstairs and say, I know what an alcoholic looks like, and you're an alcoholic and you need help, was the most loving act ever. And I went to my first 12-step meeting that night. That was 8.5 years ago now. And I'm so grateful to him for that.
How old were you at that time?
I was 43. So I'm 51 now.
Yeah, you were 43, and you say that you've been sober for 8 years now.
Mm-hmm.
But how many years have you been drinking at that point?
That's really a tough question to answer, because for me, it really snuck up slowly. Do I point at, the first week that, I was drinking every day? Do I point at the first week where I realized that having a drink during dinner was not enough? Or do I point to the first time? And I guess this is probably the best time to point to, is when I realized that having a bottle of wine at home for when my husband got home and we had dinner wasn't going to be enough. And so I was going to have that second one on board, either before he got home or hidden, so that I would have enough, and that happened when my kids were little. There's that period of time for me when, as a woman who was already struggling with anxiety disorder, and as someone who had been to law school, who had had a career, who had, done the high-powered things, I was just anxious and not bored. I mean, being home with my kids for the period of time that I was home with my kids was great, but I don't know, it snuck up on me, whatever that thing was. So that was probably, 6 years before I realized. But I knew, even before that I was becoming dependent on that daily drink, and then those daily 2 drinks, and then those daily 3 drinks for a while. But pinpointing one moment is really tough.
Yeah. But the reason I'm asking is, and you are speaking about this a little bit, because a lot of moms lose themselves right in the throes of motherhood, especially if you had a big career, if you come from this place. I mean, motherhood hits you and you're like, what, this is it? It's a little slow paced, right? It's a lot of chaos. It's a lot of the same thing every day. A lot of women go through transformation. They question their identity.
There's a lot of guilt. There's so much guilt too, because at the time I struggle with this still. My kids are now 22 and 18, but there are those moments when you're with your family and you feel guilty, like you should be working. And yet when you're working, you feel guilty and you feel like you should be with your family. And to exacerbate that, at the time when my kids were really little, my husband was in his medical training, and it's a weird thing to wake up to, have your spouse go off and literally save people's lives, literally save people's lives. And my big question for the day is, where are we going to go for a walk? Or how many books are we going to read today? And I'm not really built for hours and hours of playing with Legos. I enjoy it and I like it. And I cherish the time I had home with my children. And I'm so grateful for it. And I was very privileged that I had it. But at the same time, there was a big difference between what I felt like I was achieving in a day and what my husband was achieving in a day. And there was a lot of guilt about that, especially since I had been to graduate school and I had gone there very specifically wanting to work with kids in juvenile court and to be a teacher. And those all felt like really important things that I should also be out there doing, but I can't be two human beings. And I think that just seeded a lot of guilt and shame.
Yeah, a lot of women struggle with this. I got a call yesterday from someone. She said, I just want to do something worthwhile. I feel like this motherhood thing is not enough. Of course, they also want to contribute financially to their family or gain independence financially. And she got like some kind of job that pays $10 an hour just to get out of the house. But now she's questioning, is this worth it? Because she has all sorts of guilt. Not only she's not making a ton of money, she's not getting what she wanted to get out of this simple job.
Right. To add to that, what was interesting is at that time, because it was so expensive to live where my husband's training was, we were living in an attic space, like the tiniest. I mean, my husband's 6 feet tall and he had to duck in many of the spaces in our house. We were living there. And by the way, so grateful for this living situation because I don't know what we would have done otherwise. I was nannying for someone I really respected who was the same age as me and who was getting her PhD and who I still really admire. And we're still very close. And I'm so grateful for the role that I had in her child's life. But for me, it was, my contribution was I'm doing this nannying thing. So we have a roof over our head because the rents were so cheap. So it wasn't even like I could, go out of that. For me, getting out of the house was like school pickup and drop off and going for a walk to the library. So there were a lot of layers to my mixed feelings about being home. And again, I'm so grateful I had it, but it was complicated.
Yeah, I think it is complicated. But you were this completely different person in your college years and all throughout your youth, right? You were so you were the anti-alcohol person.
Yeah. And I thought that was unusual. When you first start in recovery, I love discussion meetings. In fact, my home group, 12-step home group, was a double speakers meeting, and which I love because it was on Sunday nights. The first half hour, the first 20 minutes was one speaker. The second 20 minutes on the second half of the hour was another speaker. And it was great. There was no discussion or anything. It was just listening to stories. And as a writer, obviously, that's fantastic. And I thought that my story was really unusual because the stories I was hearing were, I felt like when they were young, 13, 14, felt like I didn't have the instruction manual, felt like I didn't belong. And then I had my first drink and I'm like, oh, this is it. I'm going to do this forever. That was definitely not me. But I think that was also because I was so afraid. I just was scared to death because I grew up with an alcoholic parent. And the one thing I knew is I never, ever wanted to be like that person. So, talk about guilt compounding, in my 40s when I did start drinking like that person. Then on top of that, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so ashamed. And I have not a leg to stand on when criticizing that person because I'm doing the exact same thing. So I did stay away from alcohol almost completely. I drank here and there at parties and things like that during high school and college, but I was pretty regularly the designated driver and the sober one and, the peer drug and alcohol counselor and stuff like that. And then, like I said, it just slipped in later on. It just snuck up on me later on. And I found out since coming out of, the sobriety closet and, I'm on stage either virtually or in person during certain months of the year, at least a couple times a week. And I talk about being sober and in recovery every single time. And I'm coming to find out that my story is not very unusual at all. And, that's the cool thing about saying it out loud and talking about this stuff is that it empowers other people to not feel alone and to feel like they're allowed to talk about it too. So every single time I talk about being sober, I get emails upon emails from other people sharing their stories, which is amazing.
And because a lot of people don't consider that alcoholism, right? They are functioning, they are taking care of their kids, they're working, and they are drinking. I think you're also raising awareness on this because this problem, this alcoholism didn't ruin your life, right? A lot of addictions, people end up somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that that's a really slippery slope to go down because yes, I was teaching full time. I had a very full time teaching schedule. I was also writing full time at that point when I first got sober. I was teaching full time middle school, more than full time middle school. I was writing for the Atlantic, at least an article a week, and I was, taking care of two kids. So from the outside, I didn't look like I was struggling. I was drowning though. And there were a lot of balls. I'm mixing metaphors here, but there were a lot of balls in the air and I was just about to lose my balance. They were all about to fall. It was about to go really south. I was not at that point drinking during the workday. I had not gotten a DUI. I wasn't drinking and driving. I wasn't, my kids hadn't seen me really drunk and my husband hadn't caught on, but I also knew that was about to happen. All of those things were about to happen. It was right there. I could see it happening. All of my lines in the sand about what I would and wouldn't do were slipping away. And I was about to lose everything. I knew my husband would divorce me because he also had grown up with substance abuse in his family and he did not want to raise his kids around that. So I was about to lose everything. And the problem with being that good at being a drunk and being competent in my job and in my work and in my parenting was that I had to convince a lot of people when I came out about my drinking. I had friends who said that can't possibly be true. And then I had to work really hard to help them understand just how bad it was and all of the lying I had been doing. And that was a struggle. But that's the one thing that I think has become really a lot easier, especially for women. There's a real understanding now. There have been a few books that have come out in the past couple of years that have been really helpful around this, which is you don't need to make a certain score on the Am I an Alcoholic quiz in order to come to terms with the fact that alcohol is doing bad things in your life. I definitely thought that I had to be, have the symptoms of a full-blown alcoholic. I had to have, been arrested. I had to have lost things. And what was really important was not those things, but whether or not it was screwing up my life, which it absolutely was. It was making my anxiety worse. I wasn't sleeping. I was going crazy. So I think the understanding, I belong to a bunch of closed groups for women on Facebook who are struggling with sobriety or are just getting sober or are sober for a long time, a whole bunch of different groups. And over again, I'm hearing women come in and say, I think I have a problem. It's not like I'm drinking every single day and it's not like I can't function. It's just that it's really screwing up my life. And that should be the qualification. If it's upsetting for you and it's messing with your head, that is full license for you to say, okay, what's my relationship with this drug? We shouldn't have to have everything fall apart before we, are able to not make excuses and think about, and give up drinking, whether it's for, I love the sober curious movement. I love the fact that there are places that people can go and get support, for not drinking.
One thing I want to just comment on is you were already going through a lot of stress at that time when you were drinking. On top of that, you had to hide and drink in secrecy and go through so much extra mile to hide it from people. And that's a stressful thing in and of itself. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, the problem looks differently for different people and it doesn't have to be, you get DUIs or you lose everything. Then you realize I'm in trouble.
Right.
I think it's important to talk about that.
Well, and also the other problem is, it's really tempting if you do, for example, go to a 12-step meeting, you're going to hear some harrowing stories. There's this tendency that people have to compare themselves. And I currently work as a prevention and recovery coach at a detox and recovery center in Stowe, Vermont. And when I'm there, I often hear, I just didn't think I was that bad, comparing myself to X, it didn't look like I was drinking too much. And that comparison game is just not a winning strategy because, I could compare myself all day long and come to the conclusion that no, I'm not drinking and there's the common refrain, which is just horrible, is, I've spilled more than you ever drank kind of thing, as if there's some magic level that you hit and you're able to say, no, I'm really a full-blown alcoholic. And I just think that's a losing strategy, that whole making comparisons based on what you've been through versus what other people have been through.
Yeah. Your book is all about prevention for kids, for teens, and not for adults. So we're going to talk about teens and kids and substance abuse and use. What are the risk factors? You list them very well in your book. It's a very sobering book. It's very sort of alarmist, cautionary.
Honestly, I have to disagree with you. I think I am an eternal optimist. I think as a teacher, you sort of have to be. I think there's a lot there to be really optimistic about. I think when you start talking about what actually works for substance use disorder is preventable. And when you look at what actually works for substance use prevention, it's stuff that's readily available and out there for schools, educators, mentors, coaches, all this stuff. And right now we're coming out of a period when educators in particular understand, we really need to have good social emotional learning programs in our schools. And spoiler alert, the best substance use prevention programs are social emotional learning programs with great health components. So I'm optimistic. I don't think, everyone can have their own interpretation of, how to feel about it. I think there's some sobering stuff there about kids and use. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of surprising information out there about kids and use. The whole feeling like everyone is using, it's just not true. Even in college, the vast majority of kids are not drinking very often. It's just that between the media and our sort of skewed understanding of other people's investment in having alcohol around, it's called pluralistic ignorance. We tend to have an overinflated vision of how many people out there are using and abusing substances. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I'm optimistic too after reading your book. There's a lot parents can do. There is a lot of good ideas, suggestions, concrete, specific. I read a while ago, I couldn't remember where, but maybe it was some newspaper article that the drinking among millennials and the current generation, Gen Z, is declining compared to other generations, compared to my generation, Gen X. The drinkers who go to bars and drink are my generation. Not the young people. Is that true based on your research?
Yeah, so it looks like for about the past decade, all substance use among teens, with the exception of vaping, has been in decline. There was a plateau right before COVID hit. So understanding fully what's happened since COVID hit, I think it's going to take a little bit of time. We do have great surveys that come out once a year to talk about sort of kids' views on risk and views on use and how much they're actually using, but it's also been more difficult to get to kids, with surveys. So I think it's going to take a couple of years to shake out, but I was worried about that plateau as we were going into COVID. We definitely know that adults drank a heck of a lot more during COVID. And we definitely know that adult use of marijuana and psychedelics was on the rise. So I think it's going to be interesting to see over the next 18 months, 2 years, to see what kids report back specifically about their use during COVID.
Yeah. Why do some kids get addicted or start using and some don't? Let's talk about those factors. Who is at risk?
So genetics appears to be about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. So the main reason I wrote this book is that not only was I working in a drug and alcohol rehab for kids, I had these two kids who are genetically at increased risk for substance use disorder. They have first-degree relative with substance use disorder. They have second-degree relatives with substance use disorder. It's all over both sides of their family.
Can I ask one clarification? When you say genetic predisposition, is there a blood test or something, genetic testing to be done to determine that?
That would be so nice. And it would be so great if there was, the addiction gene. And there's not. We have the technology now, this technology called CRISPR, where we can go in and, essentially knock out certain genes. And it would be so great if substance use disorder was a single gene, but it's not. It's tied into personality. It's tied into brain chemistry. It's tied into body chemistry. It's tied into a lot of different things. It's not going to be an easy thing to find and just get rid of. So when we talk about genetic predisposition. We're talking about, do you have a first or second degree relative? What does your family picture look like? And honestly, there are a lot of people who tell me that they had no idea until they got into recovery and started asking questions about how many family members had substance use disorder. You might think it's one or two people, and then you start asking questions and you find out, oh no, it was uncles and aunts and cousins and all that stuff. So my kids have it fully loaded, both sides of their family. So there's nothing I can do about that. Then there's, on top of genetics, there's something called epigenetics, which is an emerging field. It means, from the Greek, it means above the genes, meaning that your environment can turn off or turn on, activate certain genes. And there's some stuff we can do about that, but that's in sort of the environment category. But in terms of the genetic stuff, there's not a ton we can do about that. So right off the bat, you can sort of just know from a genetics perspective. And then the rest of it really is about childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences include, and this is, the official list from the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, includes things like violence in the home, substance abuse in the home, physical and sexual abuse, an incarcerated parent, divorce and separation. Those are all adverse childhood experiences as defined by the CDC. However, Nadine Burke-Harris, in her wonderful book, The Deepest Well, expands that list based on her experience in pediatrics to include stuff that I just want to say, well, duh, systemic racism, adoptions on that list. There's all kinds of adverse childhood experiences that, are things that I think people could look at as a parent and say, get very defensive and say, well, when I got separated or divorced, that was actually in the best interest of my children. Well, of course it was. But we also need to look at these experiences as information, as empowering information, so that if I know that, my divorce or separation was a risk factor for my children, that I then do something about it. On top of those environmental, trauma, we also have academic failure, social ostracism, child-on-child aggression, undiagnosed learning issues. All of these compound. There are also riskier periods of time, which again, empowering information if you know about it. Transitions are highly risky for kids. So for example, when we moved my youngest kid from New Hampshire to Vermont in the gap between middle school and high school, we essentially piled a ton of new risk on him because we took him away from his friends. We took him away from his friends who had incredibly supportive parents that I trusted with my child. We, took him to a place where everything was scary and new and different for him. And that was during one of the riskiest transitional periods between middle school and high school. Luckily for me, I was having conversations at the time with Dr. Dan Siegel, and now I'm sort of transitioning into prevention stuff. He said, Jess, I hear you on how scary these risk factors seem like to you. And we do know that the adolescent brain is uniquely primed to crave novelty, which can sometimes confer risk. It's a little bit of a misnomer to say that adolescents crave risk. It's not quite true. They crave novelty. But why don't you reframe this move as exposure to all kinds of novelty? And what novelty does is it boosts kids' dopamine. And adolescents have lower baseline levels of dopamine than adults or young children. So if their brains crave dopamine, if their brains crave novelty, look, you're putting your kid in a unique situation to have all of those needs met by just reframing some of these situations, not as risk, but as opportunity. So all of those things I've mentioned, again, information can be empowering. I can feel guilty and shamed about it, about all this risk that I've piled on my kids, or I can say, okay, now I have some information and that's going to help me target my prevention on my kids a little bit more specifically, which I think is great.
Yeah, I love what Dr. Dan Siegel told you. And it's great that you shared that story here because I was going to ask about that. I read that in the book. What I want to comment on is moving in and of itself, or parental divorce in and of itself, is not a trauma or traumatic. It could be a traumatic experience, but in order for it to be a trauma, we always want to remember the 3 E's that come with trauma. It's the experience, it's the effects of the trauma, and the event itself. So you have to have all those in place. And trauma happens usually when a child doesn't have anyone, a supportive person. They're trapped and overwhelmed and they can't cope, right? So the move in this case clearly your child had his parents, you were together, you had all those buffers around. So you were worrying about his experience. But I think if you were a single mom with no job or with extra other layers of risks, for sure, that could have been a different experience for your son.
Right. I mean, I think I constantly am acknowledging that one of the reasons I talk so much about being an alcoholic is that I'm allowed to. I am a white woman with a spouse at home. I have support. I'm not worried about where our next meal is coming from. So when I come out and say I'm an alcoholic, and by the way, I have, I write for various, very successful outlets and have a New York Times bestselling book, people say, "Oh, that is so brave of you." However, if I come out as an alcoholic and I am, for example, a single mother of color, people are going to look at that as there's no talk of hero there. There's talk of, well, we're going to need to make sure your children are safe. We're going to send someone out to your house. That it's a very dangerous and different situation. I'm allowed to talk about my alcoholism and be viewed in a very different light so it is, I feel very obligated to do that. And I'm also extremely cognizant of the fact that when we talk about risk factors for kids, as you mentioned, we know that when kids have one supportive adult in their lives who support them, love them for who they are, see them, hear them, love them with there being no sort of
conditions. Yeah.
Conditions. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. Then we know that those kids are more likely to do better. And I think for a lot of parents, we feel like we have to be that person. And that is absolutely not true. I think people don't look to allies. And, for example, I have two nieces and I love them so much. And their mom, their dad can't be everything to them. So as an aunt who has struggled with substance use disorder, their mom doesn't. And I'm so grateful that she didn't. I have a perspective that their mom doesn't. And so I get to be another ally for those kids. And if they need something that their parents can't provide, they have an aunt or they have a coach. One of my nieces has a coach that she can talk to, and that's an essential person. Often it's a teacher. So I think we really need to be thinking about, especially if you're in a position where you can't be all things to all people, allies are going to be super important. But all of this conversation, I acknowledge over and over and over again, comes from a place of great privilege that I'm extremely grateful for. I have support. I talk to women all the time whose spouse is not supportive of their getting sober. And, this is a pretty common thing that if one person in a toxic environment tries to get out of that toxic environment, the other people are those, crabs that are trying to pull them back down into the bucket because, if your spouse is going to get sober and you don't want to think about your own drinking, then that's an extremely scary place to be. So, I have worked with people over and over again who don't have that support. So again, definitely coming at all of this from a place of privilege.
I think it gives permission to other people to look at their own relationship with substances. Yes, you're coming from a privileged place, but you are shedding light to something important. And as we mentioned in the beginning, the problem doesn't have to be this out of control problem to be a problem. By speaking up, you're giving voice to this issue.
I also, every week at the rehab with the kids that I taught, because there was so much turnover because kids were constantly coming and going at the rehab, I was always having to introduce myself every week because there was always someone new. And I would say, and I'm an alcoholic and I've been in recovery for however many years. And always one kid would say, "You don't look like an alcoholic." And, that to me, I think that's code for, you're not some old homeless person puking in
without
the gutter. You're not right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, I love what Stephen King says, who is also in recovery, long time recovery. We all look the same when we're puking in the gutter, I think. So, there's not much difference between me and another alcoholic in terms of, especially in recovery. And I hate that you don't look like an alcoholic situation because I have met plenty of high function, and I hate the term high functioning, but people who could pull off that exterior gloss and get away with, drinking to excess for a while. But yeah, anyway, anything we can do to dispel that, you don't look like an alcoholic or you don't look like a drug abuser thing is a good thing.
But I have a problem with the word I'm an alcoholic. I don't like labels like this. And when I read that, when you start your book, right? Hi, I'm Jess, I'm an alcoholic. I don't want people identifying themselves because I work with people who struggle with substance abuse, addiction, and it has a bad taste in my mouth. I don't like identifying people with their labels. Like, I want to know, how do you feel about this? When you say, I'm an alcoholic, even now you aren't, right, anymore.
Oh, no, I absolutely am. If I took a drink today, I'm still right where I left off. I have a friend who relapsed just recently. She had years sober. And not only did she relapse, she ended up having to go back into detox. She was dangerous. It was a really dangerous situation within a week. All respect to, your feelings about the word alcoholic. And we're in a situation right now where all of the style guides for journalists, and as a journalist, I have 4 different style guides sitting over there on my desk. The AP came out a couple of years ago. We're supposed to say a person with a substance use disorder. It's supposed to be person first, or I am a woman with an alcohol use disorder. And when I refer to other people, I do them that service of seeing them as a human being with alcohol use disorder. I never use the word alcoholic for anyone but myself. But I grew up in a home where we were not allowed to call things for what they were. There was a huge, invisible to other people, as Susan Cheever says, elephant in the middle of our house that was wrecking our lives and wrecking our family and wrecking our home. And no one was allowed to talk about it. We were not allowed to say the word elephant. We got punished if we said the word elephant. And, as a writer, words are sacred to me. And a person with alcohol use disorder absolutely applies to who I am. But growing up in a house where we had a parent that drank too much and it was ruining our family, and not being able to say the word alcoholic, I own this word very proudly because I not only am an alcoholic, I'm allowed to say that word. And so for myself, I got to interview Alan Alda a bunch of years ago for The Atlantic. And one of the things I had noticed in his writing is that he and I both really hate euphemisms. When his mom was dying, no one would say the word dying. They would say all kinds of other pretty words to dress up what was happening. And over again in his books, he talks about how angry he gets when people want to use a word other than the word that it actually is. And I totally vibed with that because I feel the same way. And so when I was in a position to say, look, I grew up with a parent who had alcohol use disorder, and I have that too. For some reason, for me, the word alcoholic felt urgent, it felt true, and it felt important, and far be it from me to cast aspersions on the word they want to use that defines them. There's a book out there that I love called My Fair Junkie, and she refers to herself as a junkie because for her, in order to stay in touch with the person that she was and the person that she's trying not to be ever again. This is Amy Dressner's book, My Fair Junkie. Amy uses the word junkie. It's a really important word for her to be very honest about who she was and where she can be very easily again if she starts to use. So if that's what keeps you sober, use the word you need to use. I will give other people the respect of using person first language, but that's not necessarily where I am with my own understanding of how at risk I am every single day and that I need to be vigilant.
And do you still feel like you are at risk?
Oh, absolutely. Every day I have to make the decision not to drink. Every single day. It would be, I still have anxiety disorder. A drink would be lovely. The drink I miss the most is the one that I can't have right before I go out and go to like a dinner party or something. When I'm out at a dinner party, every once in a while, I think about how much alcohol would have to be here for me to feel safe. And then it's not just about how much alcohol would have to be here in order for me to feel safe that there's enough, but how blind would the other people have to be for me to feel like I could drink the way I wanted to drink? And the answer is there's never enough alcohol, and everyone here would have to leave. And then I'd be all by myself, which is what drinkers do, which is what alcoholics do, which is isolate so that we can drink the way we want to drink. My ideal drinking world is me alone, drinking by myself, so no one can criticize what I'm doing. And that is horribly frightening. And so I have to stay on top of that every single day. And are there days that go by that I don't think about drinking? Absolutely. But it's a decision I have to make for myself, every day is, do I want to go through my day feeling the things that I feel at full strength without being able to numb, and that comes down to other things like, just little things like this is how I know that I'm always at risk. It would be so easy for me to say, I'm having a little trouble going to sleep tonight. I'm going to take something to sleep, or I'm going to drink some NyQuil, or I'm going to, have a little hit of THC in order to help me go to sleep. But the reality is, why am I having trouble falling asleep? It's probably because I'm not getting enough exercise, or I'm not dealing with my anxiety, or I didn't move enough today. Whatever that thing is, every single day I have to say, okay, well, I think I'm going to deal with the root cause of that instead of treating the symptoms of that. And on the other hand, the other thing is I also think like someone who is prone to substance abuse, which is, I could take one of these. The instructions say to take one, but wouldn't two be better? There's all of that thinking that helps me remember, oh, no, I am still very much at risk for relapse. And for me, that means I have to go to meetings. It means I have to do my work, my service work, which is working at the rehab. By the way, for me, it is service work. I don't get paid for my work at the rehab. It all goes to a fund, a scholarship fund for young adults who need treatment and can't afford it. And I have to do those things or I'm very much at risk. And, watching my friend relapse just this past year, I thought she had it all under control. I really did. And to find out that she had to go back into detox was devastating, but it was also a good reminder.
But what if you're with people, like you're at the party or something like that, where people are drinking around you? How do you navigate that? And do you have to tell other people always about your situation?
No.
Or do
My
people
husband
pressure you? Because people pressure, no?
I have, well, okay. So first of all, I'm a public person. I talk about my drinking constantly. It's in my, I have however many Twitter followers, many thousands of Twitter followers, and it says in my bio that I'm sober. I talk about it all the time. It is my platform. So it's difficult to get very far with me and not know that I'm sober. My husband drinks, though. He has no problems with alcohol, but he also understands that as a spouse who cares for his wife, it would not be kind to keep open alcohol in the house. So there is no open alcohol ever in our house. If he has a drink and he doesn't finish it, he pours it out. So that's that's modeling, caring for your partner and caring for the people around you. My friends, as skeptical as they were when I first came out about all this, I now have friends that are so supportive. One in particular, when we go somewhere, will call ahead and make sure there are non-alcoholic options for me. When I went to a party at a college recently, a parents' weekend at my son's college recently, I took non-alcoholic beer with me in a bag because I figured, well, if I would want something in my hand other than booze, there probably are going to be other people that will as well. So yes, people can drink around me. I am not bothered by that at all. Do I want it open in my house? No. Also, the thing I talk with the people I work with, the clients at Sana, about a lot is I always have an exit strategy. I do not feel guilty about saying it's time for me to go home. One of the things we talk about in recovery a lot is if you're feeling at risk, you have to pause and say, halt. Am I H, hungry? Am I A, angry? Am I L, lonely? Or tired, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And I'm probably one of those things if I'm feeling like I need to get out of there. And sleepy is another one for me. And so if when I'm done at a party, I'm done. And my husband and I have a little signal and we're out of there. And having an exit strategy is important, I think, for everybody to feel safe about where they are socially and from a mental health perspective. So making sure that, the clients I work with have an exit strategy, that they have a sober community around them. I have people I can text at any time, day or night, that will be there for me if I need them. And that's a really important part of my recovery as well.
You write in the book that you raised your first son differently than your second son in regards with this. I would love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, the younger kid is not a fan of this situation, but he also, so just to start over, my older son is 22 and he grew up in a home where if he wanted a sip of something, my husband and I were having a particularly nice bottle of wine, he would be allowed a sip or even his own glass as he got older. And what I know now is that parents with a permissive approach around drinking or drugs are far, not slightly, far more likely to have children that will have a substance use disorder during their lifetime. So, knowing that, and I did not know that before, knowing that now, I'm essentially modeling for my kid what I talk about in The Gift of Failure, my first book, all the time, which is we operate from the doing our best with the best information that's in front of us. And if we learn something new and we realize we've made a mistake, we don't deny the mistake. We don't blame the mistake on someone else. We say, oh, okay, I have new information now. My mistake. I'm going to do better now based on this new information. And because we talk about substance use disorder and use all the time, my kids know a lot of what I know that's in the addiction inoculation. And so my younger son knows that parents that have a consistent and clear message of no, not until it's legal for you, which is code in my mind anyway, for not until your brain is almost done developing, because adolescent brains are developing at an unbelievable rate and they're exquisitely susceptible to environmental factors that can get in the way of the way their brain is developing. If I were to turn to my 18-year-old and say, yeah, I know that parents that have a consistent and clear message of no, not until it's legal for you, have kids with much lower rates of substance use disorder, but I don't care. I'm going to let you have some anyway, because it's easier for me or because I want you to think I'm cool. Then what I'm saying to my kid is, I could really take your lifetime well-being into account here, but I'm not going to bother because whatever. He knows that if I say, yeah, have a sip, that I'm specifically flying in the face of the data that is right there at my fingertips that I wrote about and that he knows about. So I'm doing the best with what the information I have, which is all I could ever ask from him. If he makes a mistake and he learns how to do better, my hope is that he would take the new information and change what he's doing moving forward. So I'm modeling not only the addiction inoculation stuff, but also gift of failure stuff, which is do the best you can with the information you have at hand.
How about your older son? Is he drinking socially now that he's 22? Legal age?
First of all, well, number one, so there are certain lines I draw in the sand in terms of privacy of my children. Like I'm allowed to talk about certain things and I'm not allowed to talk about certain things. So he is 22. He is an adult. That is his business, how he's drinking. And if he's drinking, how he's drinking, any of that stuff. On the other hand, because my kids are at higher risk, we do a lot of talking about the difference between use and abuse and what that looks like, what that feels like. I can tell them very viscerally what it felt like for me when that drink a day, 2 drinks a day turned into a bottle a day, and how defensive I felt about my drinking and all that stuff. So we talk about that a lot. Prevention for me is 2 things. I can't guarantee that if I do every single thing that I talk about in The Gift of Failure and the addiction inoculation, that my kids will not have any problems, that they'll be fully resilient and they will have no problems with substance use disorder. I can't say that. I can't guarantee that. What I can do is I can give them as much information as possible that might possibly prevent their getting a substance use disorder. On the other hand, though, I want them to have, I look at addiction as let's say a 100-piece puzzle. My dad, when he told me I was an alcoholic, was the 100th piece in my puzzle that sort of got me into recovery. But I needed pieces 1 through 98 to be in place before piece 100 could fall into place. And I'm grateful it did. For my kids, though, I don't want them to start at piece 0. I do not, if my older son, who's 22, starts at piece 0, I'm screwed, right? Because if he starts to have a problem, it's going to take an awfully long time for him to get to a place where he gets help. All of this prevention, they're pieces in his puzzle. So if he does start to have a problem, he might start at piece 35 or piece 50. There's a saying in recovery that relapsing is never as much fun as it was the first time around because you have all this pesky information in your head about what it's doing to you. And I want him to have that pesky information in his head. I joke with friends of mine that I want to harsh his buzz. I want to, help him see that anything that positive that he feels that drinking or using drugs and alcohol might be doing for him has a downside. And I want him to be aware of the downside. It's never going to work for us to say just drugs and alcohol are bad, because that's a lie. People wouldn't use drugs and alcohol if they were all bad. It's a really ridiculous way to go. So anyway, the prevention stuff is all, it's not just about prevention. It's about getting kids to peace 100 if they need to get there.
So at some point you told your children about your substance abuse?
The week after, I came out to obviously my dad, my husband first. And I think it was that week that I told my kids.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you muster up a courage to speak about this with your kids?
I think when you grow up in a house where there's a lot of lying and obfuscation and gaslighting going on about a parent's substance use or whatever it is, whether you're being abused and you're not allowed to talk about it, or you're, you have an incarcerated relative and you're ashamed and you don't want to tell it, whatever that thing is. For me, honesty has been at the forefront of my parenting and my husband's parenting. My husband was fortunate enough to grow up with parents who really treated him like he could handle truth. And that has really shaped our lives as academics. It's shaped our lives as writers. It has shaped our lives as parents. And so I'm always going to err on the side of honesty. And it is my instinct to be honest with my kids from the very beginning. And, obviously they don't need to know, for example, if we were having dire financial straits and it was, putting our family at risk, and there's no reason to give them all the gory details of that because I don't need them worrying about that stuff. But I think when it comes to human foibles and the risk that they're then also dealing with. And, they were 9 and 14. They weren't 3 and 6. There's a cognitive development and an emotional development aspect to this as well. But, prevention, substance use prevention starts in pre-K, kindergarten. It's not necessarily about discussing, intravenous drug use. It starts with talking about health and safety. So the only way we're going to get our arms around this whole prevention thing is to start young and to be honest about various aspects of not only our own use, but what drugs and alcohol are, why some people use them, and the downside.
And how did they receive that information when you delivered? And did you prepare for it? Like, what you're going to say, how you're going to say it? I'm curious about this. Sorry.
No, it's a really good question.
Because people always have difficulties speaking with their kids. So by you speaking, it also gives people an idea or permission to talk about certain things.
Yeah, I think because Gift of Failure had been out for a while and there's a lot of honesty around making mistakes.
I still remember your mistakes and your stories from that book.
Well, we talk a lot about, we are our kids' best first teachers, and we're also their role models to a certain extent, to a big extent. So if I make a huge mistake at work, the worst thing I can do is keep that from my kids, because it is an incredible opportunity to model my response to making a mistake and to ask for forgiveness and all that other stuff. So, I've never really been scared of telling my kids the truth. Fear has never been, and shame, I've tried really hard to make that not a part of it either. And, I don't remember being afraid. I do remember it being a relief, but you also have to keep in mind, I have 2 kids who, especially now as teenagers and young adults, their preferred, how do I explain this? My younger son tends to tell my older son things sometimes before he'll tell us, because he really, really likes the way his big brother responds, which is, and I tried to get him to tell me exactly what it is about what he likes about his big brother's response. And he said, I love that Ben just kind of goes, okay. So that's the way they've always preferred to respond to things. I have kids who tend to think about things very deeply and then talk about them. So, I could also have kids who are prone to being scared of things and are prone to being scared of mommy relapsing and prone to being scared of what that means for them. And that's just not the kind of kids I happened to have, but I know lots of kids like that. And so I think you really have to be in tune with your kids. I say this all the time in my speaking, you have to love the kids you have, not the kids you wish you had. They're not going to respond the way I want them to respond. They're going to respond the way they respond. And, frankly, I might have appreciated a little bit more of a response from my kids because, maybe a little sympathy, maybe a little like, oh, I was having a woe is me moment, but that's just not the way my kids respond to things. They tend to be pretty matter of fact about stuff. So I think knowing your kids well and understanding how they need to get information and how they're likely to respond is a really important part of being honest with them about difficult things. This is also not the first time we'd had to have a conversation about a relative having substance use disorder. I'd had to make decisions because I had a parent with substance use disorder. I had to make decisions about my children's safety based on moment-to-moment decisions about that person's sobriety. And we'd had conversations about that. And substance use has wrecked holidays. And I've always been honest with them about why and what that meant and why we're not in touch with certain relatives and why we're in touch with other ones. And, and why it's important to keep people in your life who are healthy and not going to hurt you and going to keep you safe and not put you in physical and emotional peril. So those kind of conversations were something they were fairly used to.
Yeah, I think you talk about having conversations a lot in your book and starting early. And that's a wonderful thing. So just the last question before I let you go. What are your top 3 favorite prevention tools, if you will, that parents can use? I mean, you talk about school programs, you talk about nurses, healthcare, a lot of things in your book that is like a huge list of things. But if you were to really hone in onto the parenting in that home environment, what would be those 3 main things?
There's a quote in the book that is from Chris Herron, someone that I really admire and have gotten to watch him speak a bunch. He was one of the Boston Celtics, and he had opioid use disorder and nearly died. He says in his work, and there's a 30 for 30 ESPN documentary where he says this, and it's a fantastic documentary if you get a chance to watch it. His last name is Herron, Herren. He says, we spend so much time worrying about that last drunk or that last drink or how dark or deep someone went. But what we really need to be talking about is the first drink. And for me, that is really important. My entire career has been dedicated to helping educate kids, helping kids feel fulfilled and empowered and like they have self-efficacy and like they deserve to take up space in this world and be loved. And kids who do not feel like they're worth taking up space in this world, or they don't deserve to be loved, or they don't deserve to be protected and cared for, or they feel like they're not being seen for who they are, those are the kids who are going to make themselves feel better, seek out ways to make themselves feel better with substances. So how do we notice and realize when our kids are not feeling like they're enough? And how do we make kids feel like they are enough? And just pumping them up with empty platitudes is not going to help either. How do we build kids' self-esteem and self-efficacy so that they feel like they are enough? Helping kids feel enough every day. I think about how do I not necessarily make their lives easier, do things for them, fix everything for them, but how do I make them feel more competent? How do I make them feel like they are worth being in this world and that they contribute something to this world? That's sort of at the top of my brain every day. Viewing this all as a long haul job, both for gift of failure stuff and addiction inoculation stuff is a big part of this picture. Do I want, for example, the dishwasher loaded quickly right now, the way I like it to be loaded? Or do I want a kid who's going to be able to do it himself next time? And do I want a kid who feels competent? I have 2 kids who are heading out in the world to make their way in the world without me. And I don't want them to be helpless. The only way we're going to help kids get out there into the world with their feet underneath them and feeling strong and powerful and like they have efficacy is to give them that opportunity before they leave our homes. And so that's a big part of making kids feel like they're enough. I mean, the simple answer is talk early, talk often. In the book, I give scripts for ways to talk to kids from a very young age all the way through college. So talk early, talk often. That's essential. We can't afford to ignore this and hope. Just like there isn't one sex talk, there's also not one substance use disorder talk or a substance use talk. It's a lot of talks. The more often you do it, the easier it will become. These are super loaded conversations, and parents are scared to death of them, of both the sex talks and the substance use talk. But I promise the more often you have them, the easier they become. So talk early, talk often. Remember, this is a long haul job. Parenting wins don't necessarily happen in the everyday emergencies. They happen, in sort of the big picture. And, help your kids feel as empowered, as competent, not just confident. Help them feel like they deserve a place in this world. And, take a really clear look. There's a kid that I profile in the book. Her name is Georgia. And she had anxiety disorder from the time she was really young. And her parents took her to the hospital, got her assessed for all kinds of gastric problems because she had stomach aches every day. She and I actually were very similar that way. I had stomach problems as a kid too, due to anxiety. And, I was fortunate in that my parents didn't stop looking at my stomach. They thought, okay, well, what could be causing these stomach aches? And they got me help for that. Thinking about, why is my kid suddenly acting differently? Why is my kid having stomach aches? Why is my kid feeling like they have no friends? Why is my kid feeling like they don't belong? Having those sorts of thoughts and getting at the source rather than treating the symptoms is going to be a really important part of parenting for prevention and for kids who are competent, which, is again part of prevention, which is, I didn't expect that these books would dovetail so nicely, but they do. Kids who feel like they have self-efficacy are far less likely to also need substances to make them feel like they deserve a place in the world.
Yeah, they do go together. The two books do go together. And I love the story in the book. I just read it this morning again, how you help your son navigate the airport on his own so that he can feel that he is able to do this. I just love that story.
Well, it just would never occur to us. I mean, my younger son in particular, used to travel with me all the time because my work trips were also really cool learning opportunities for him. And it just never occurred to me. It's just, I get all freaked out at the airport and it's faster and it's more efficient. But stopping, I lied about how much time we had till our flight and I fudged the numbers and we got there nice and early, relaxed. And I said, okay, what do we do now? And I'm happy to, and I'm there. I'm not leaving them. I'm not abandoning them. I'm supporting them, but I'm helping them figure out what they need to do for the first time. When my oldest son was filling out his application for a driver's license, the girl next to him was texting and her mom was filling out her application for her driver's license and asking the daughter how tall she was and how much she weighed at her last doctor's appointment. I don't want the first time my kid travels on his own to be the first time he's navigated an airport. I don't want the first form my kid has ever filled out to be his first insurance form. I want my kids to go into these things feeling like they've had some exposure to them and they've known how to do them. And that's what's going to help them not be as scared and not be as helpless and feel like they have that self-efficacy thing I keep railing on about.
Yeah, excellent point. So thank you so much for sharing your time, your wisdom. Have a fantastic rest of your day and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you. Well, and thank you so much for asking me to be on the podcast. I was really touched by your invitation to come on and I'm really grateful. So thank you.
Handwritten note, right?
Handwritten notes, baby. I love them.
I love the pets.
Thanks so much.
The cat and the dog are part of this whole process.
Yeah, the cat keeps jumping up in my lap the whole time I'm talking. He needs love, I suppose.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jess.
You're so welcome.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. What's your biggest takeaway? Did this episode bring up some stuff for you? Did you find it useful? I love hearing from you. Reach out, send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. Call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website, authenticparenting.com/contact. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. It takes a couple of seconds, but it's very helpful. Or by becoming a patron on patreon.com. With a small monthly contribution, you can support your favorite show and get supporter-only benefits and content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/authentic parenting. One-time donations are also welcomed. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Pandora, and elsewhere. And you can connect with me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use and somewhat enjoy. Until next week, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.